Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen provides readers with a vivid portrayal of the common English life in the early 19th century, a period marked by distinct social hierarchies and rigid gender roles. At the heart of the novel, it is the Bennet family whose experience serves as a microcosm of the broader social dynamics of the time. The Bennets are in search of a man for each of their daughters to marry, when Mr. Bingley, a wealthy man, moves in close to them. They attend his balls to meet him and other possible suitors. Mr. Darcy, who is Mr. Bingley's friend, also attends, but he is snarky and rude to Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth establishes her prejudices about him and develops her initial hatred towards him. Mr. Collins is the Bennet's cousin and rightful heir to their land when Mr. Bennet dies. He is the rightful heir because of the English tradition dictating that the next closest male relative is entitled to the land and wealth of the deceased. The Bennet family attends multiple balls in search of an heir, and this is where Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy frequently cross paths and begin to develop their relationship. In the climax, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, but she declines as she still holds her prejudices about him and considers him to be the same as any arrogant, egotistical man. Mr. Darcy then writes to Elizabeth a letter explaining why she holds these prejudices about him and how they are misunderstandings. Firstly, the explanation for Mr. Bingley's separation from Jane. Mr. Darcy acknowledges that he played a major role in their separation, but he says it is due to Jane's social standing and he was looking out for the best interest of him. He knows that Jane and Mr. Bingley could never be together because of their social class. Secondly, was concerns about the Bennet family behavior in search of a husband. The younger daughters in particular were lacking in social decorum and propriety. This created reservations about him forming a connection with the Bennet family. Third, he went into his true feelings for Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy acknowledges that his feelings for Elizabeth have grown and he cannot suppress his attraction to her anymore. He knows that they are of different social class and his family will not approve, but he can't help himself. He wins Elizabeth over when he acknowledges her intelligence, wit, and charm. In the end, Mr. Bingley and Jane marry despite social class, and Darcy proposes to Elizabeth in an appropriate manner to her. She accepts, and they are happily married and save her family's land. Multiple symbols were used in this novel. The grander the house, the higher your social standing. This highlights how important social status was in British society. If you were poor, you were expected to marry poor. But if you were rich, you were expected to marry rich. The Bennets were an exception to this symbolism. Their house was brilliant, exceptional, and large, but they were considered to be lower social class. Their social class, instead, was lowered because they had no male heirs to inherit their house. This resulted in their social class being dependent on who their daughters marry. Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate, is grand but charming. His estate is meant to be warm and welcoming, similarly to Mr. Darcy being intimidating at first, but welcoming as the story unfolds and we learn more about him. As we spend more time learning about Mr. Darcy, we spend more time in Pemberley because of the balls and become more familiar with it. Elizabeth spends a lot of time walking around in nature, and she enjoys the peace of the garden paths, the palaces she visits. This is in contrast to being trapped inside the walls where she is meant to be in the balls. Nature serves as her escape from reality and a chance to be her own independent self. She feels natural outside, and this is where she learns more about herself and becomes more familiar with Mr. Darcy. This novel takes place during a time when gender roles were strictly enforced. Men were highly influential, and women were meant to marry the men. Their sense of importance to society was based on the men around them. Elizabeth challenged this idea because she was not interested in marrying Mr. Darcy for his money. Rather, she found him disgusting at first and grew to love him for his personality. She did all of this unknowingly of his fortune. Social class was seen throughout the novel because it plays a major role in British life during their time. Social class dictates status and romantic relationships. Noble and wealthy families were unlikely to marry below their social class. This was because their idea of marriage was focused on obtaining wealth and land. Love and marriage, through the form of social class, became a complex issue where you might not love someone, but you have to marry them, or you do love someone, but you can't be with them. This pitted old versus new money against each other because old families were seen as higher social class and new money families are still trying to establish themselves as worthy to be with them. Elizabeth Bennet is our protagonist of the novel. She is searching for a husband alongside her five sisters in an attempt to save their family's land. She is highly intelligent as she frequently converses as brilliantly as those in her social class, in a higher social class than her. Her wittiness is her downfall because she makes sly remarks about her love interests. These love interests include Mr. Darcy and her cousin that she is supposed to marry. She's incredibly independent and knows that she does not need a man to feel like she has lived a virtuous life. I found that Elizabeth contradicts everything about the character Mrs. Dalloway from the novel of the same name. Mrs. Dalloway is completely dependent on her love interest, and she chooses the safer option in Richard Dalloway than choosing the more exciting man in Peter Walsh. I found that Mr. Dalloway represents Mr. Collins and Peter represents Mr. Darcy. I found this comparison because Mr. Collins and Mr. Dalloway are both empty personalities and men that are devout to classic English tradition. They offer a meager life to each of the women and cannot satisfy their needs. Peter and Mr. Darcy both exhibit the chance and fun in life. They are exciting opportunities for the woman, but only Elizabeth is brave enough to take that chance. Mrs. Dalloway is left wondering the what if had she ended up with Peter. Elizabeth and Mrs. Dalloway can be compared because they represent what happens if you don't take the chance and how Mrs. Dalloway could be Elizabeth if roles are reversed. Letters, they represent the sole method of long-distance communication. They serve to advance the plot, with Mr. Collins' letter to the Bennets announcing his arrival is a show of his arrogance and expectation to be treated better because of his wealth. Mr. Darcy uses his letter to Elizabeth to explain why he behaved how he did with Mr. Wickham. This changes Elizabeth and our understanding as a reader of his character. Jane's letter propels the plot to the resolution because it shares the news of Lydia's elopement and how this lowers her social class and how the Bennet family is worried for her. Journey, a change in the story. As characters journey into the world, they advance the plot by learning more about themselves. Elizabeth's trips to Pemberley and Hunsford allow her to interact with Mr. Darcy to begin their involvement together. Dracula by Bram Stoker uses these same motifs. The characters write letters to other members in their battalion to convey vital information, like Van Helsing's letter to Dr. Seward. Do not fail to be at Hillingham tonight. Dr. Seward could not reach Lucy in time because the letter had to travel and he arrived too late and Dracula had gotten to Lucy. The pattern of journey is also apparent in Dracula because the main plot was the characters had to journey to a land unfamiliar to their own. The Westerners had to travel east to Transylvania, and they were in a new world and discovering new ways to advance the plot. I found that journey was most apparent in both of these stories. Pride and Prejudice is a historical and beloved novel that would serve great as an excellent addition to this course syllabus. The story is very well known, and the novel has been adapted into a miniseries and a movie to make accessing the story easier. This novel highlights what English life was like during the early 1800s. We learn how dominant social class was and how gender roles played a factor in everyday life. Both of these themes are already found in other novels we read, like Dracula and Mrs. Dalloway, so they would tie in perfectly. Since Elizabeth tends to contradict the sense of gender role, I think that it would allow for a great opportunity to showcase the differences between the character Mrs. Dalloway and highlight what her life could have been like had she married who she truly wanted in Peter Walsh. I think that there is also a comparison to be made between Elizabeth and Lucy from Dracula. In essence, Pride and Prejudice not only offers a glimpse into the daily lives of the characters in the Bennet family, but also serves as a commentary on the broader societal structures that shape the lives of individualism in the 19th century England.